This is Your Bird Story, a broadcast of bird stories told by everyday people about their interactions and relationships with wild birds in cities. This season is funded by the Voice for Nature Foundation. I'm your host, Georgia Silvera Seamans. Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Your Bird Story. Today I will be talking with Emmett White, and I'm going to turn it over to Emmett to make introductions.
Hi everybody, I'm Emmett. I live in New York City. I'm a Brooklyn-based artist, and I do taxidermy. That's how I came to meet Georgia. She was on a panel at a yearly event that's hosted by Gotham Taxidermy, who's a local taxidermist here in New York City. Georgia was a judge on a panel there, and I was presenting a piece of art, which I am sure we will talk about here. And Georgia was kind enough to invite me on the show.
Just in how you first introduced yourself, you said I'm an artist and I do taxidermy. So a couple things there. Tell us what taxidermy is and why you consider it an art.
Sure. Well, so for anybody who doesn't know, taxidermy is the art or the craft of taking an animal that has deceased and giving life back to it. The general process, I mean, it's different for different kinds of animals, but the general process is you are removing the skin from a dead animal, treating or processing that skin in some kind of way, putting it on a mount that could be made out of a whole different range of materials, posing it, and basically bringing life back to an animal that has died. And I'm pretty sure the Latin taxidermy is derived from is taxi meaning move and dermy meaning skin. So literally moving skin. So taxidermy is. Most of my background is actually not in visual art. My background is actually more in a lot of more performance-based art. Most of my background is in music and theater. Way back when I was a little kid, before I got into music, the first thing that I ever wanted to be was an ornithologist. So I've always been a big bird nerd, always been a big animal nerd. And then during the pandemic, when I was stuck at home all the time, I got really into collecting taxidermy, like already finished taxidermy, antique taxidermy, which sort of evolved into then restoring it and making displays for things, just because the things that I was displaying in my personal space, I wanted to find ways to amplify them. And then eventually, I mean, it didn't take long before I just got so into the rabbit hole that I was like, I need to learn how to do this myself. And it's actually been really great just because, talking about taxidermy as an art form, it is this really interesting place where it's like the perfect cross section between art and science, because it really does have an enormous amount of scientific value too, and research value, which is something I can talk about more. There really is I feel like in the same way with, things like woodworking or metal, where, I mean, there's a really meticulous kind of a craft to it that there's really a lot of skill to learn. I mean, I've only been doing it for a few years, and I constantly feel like I still have so much to learn. It is also very expressive, and it's been an interesting cross section for me. I think having all this interest in science as a kid, and then being really into creating things and making art as a teenager and a college age kid, and then it's kind of been a really cool middle ground to merge.
Did you learn on your own at a school? Do you have a mentor?
I took a couple of classes. I mean, so someone who actually has been incredibly helpful is Divya, who runs Wunderkammer, which is actually how I come to do Wunderkammer the first time, which was last year, so the year before. There are not a ton of taxidermists in New York. So when I was first getting really into it, I was emailing around to anybody I could find, and Divya was nice enough to we got on Zoom for a couple hours, and she answered like a ton of questions for me and really kind of got me started. She really gave me a lot of really helpful information. A lot of it I've also just, YouTube videos, books, a lot of trial and error. It's sort of a uniquely hard art form I've found. You really got to be willing to teach yourself a lot of stuff. Everybody in the community around it is amazing, but it is just a small community. It's not like, I mean, if you want to learn how to do pottery, in New York City. There are like a million places you can take a pottery class. There's a lot of places you can tap for knowledge and places you can go. Taxidermy is a little more niche. So, I think people are always really excited and enthusiastic to be helpful.
Can you talk about how you source the animals that you taxidermy?
Sure. So I get them from all kinds of places. You do have to be a little bit creative because, as some of your listeners might know, we have a lot of laws in the United States that protect local wildlife, particularly an enormous amount of laws that protect birds. So most birds that are actually endemic to the US, you cannot taxidermy them. You can't legally own them, which is sort of interesting being a taxidermist in the United States because a lot of the animals that are actually immediately around you are sort of off limits. So I do use stuff I find when I'm able to use it because there are some exceptions to those laws. Pigeons, house sparrows, European starlings, because they're all technically invasive species. So when I come across those, I'll use those. Things that don't make it from breeders or pet stores or different kinds of farms, things like that. They're all animals that have died by no fault of someone else. Well, for the most part. I mean, window strikes, we can talk about that whole thing. But yeah, mostly animals that have died naturally. I've done quite a few like stillborn things or, things that just have not made it past that early stage. But yeah, I get them from all over the place.
Okay. That last category of animal sounds like it would be a challenge to work with, but I'm curious. You talk about pigeons, starlings, and house sparrows. Those are the unregulated birds. They're not covered by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Your entry in Wunderkammer was, if I recall, the title is Window Strike. Could you describe visually the piece for folks who didn't see it, and this is a an audio podcast? If you could describe your entry and the inspiration for that piece. I have to tell folks that it was a striking piece and powerful because you think about the hundreds of thousands of birds who die by window strike in New York City, and certainly many millions more throughout the US annually.
Essentially, what the piece was I took 4 vintage antique, if you sort of imagine like an old apartment building, the kind of like wooden rimmed windows they would have in a place like that. I had 4 of those windows and I put them together in sort of a big square. And I had a big wooden frame that was holding it up straight. So it was these 4 windows put together, probably about 5 feet long by almost 6 feet tall or something. There were 9 pigeons that I had mounted in the position of it was displaying them crashing into the window. So you had their necks and their wings bent, and it was showing that moment of collision is the best way that I can probably describe it. The inspiration for the piece was that, which I talked a little bit about at the presentation. I was thinking about the fact that it's really interesting. I mean, taxidermy is an art form that is completely derived from death. I mean, it doesn't exist without it, but death is not often focused on in it. I mean, so much of the art form is about bringing life back to animals. The pieces of taxidermy I've seen that do show death are not from the point of view of the animal that's dying. Like there's a lot of mounts out there. If you go into like an antique shop, you might see like a coyote with like a pheasant hanging out of its mouth or something, and you'll see a lot of pieces like that, but that's really from the point of view of the predator. I mean, the predator is the animal that is the focal point of that display. And so the initial inspiration was sort of thinking about that and wanting to do a piece that made death and how these animals came to be able to be a part of this art form, to really make that the focal point. And originally, my concept was actually because all the pigeons that I used, these 9 pigeons that I used in this display, they were all New York street pigeons that I had found deceased. Originally, it was the concept was a little bit wider, and it was going to be a whole bunch of smaller displays with singular pigeons showing all the different kinds of ways that pigeons die in New York City. Because obviously, window strikes are big, but you've also got accidental ingestion of poisons, you've got electrocution, domestic animals, dogs, cats, etc. But, as I was sort of mapping it out and starting to put it together, there were just certain elements of it that were a little impractical to put together. And also it was just really busy piece. so when I was trying to think about how I wanted to focus it and condense it, I ended up focusing on window strikes because I just felt like out of all those things, it's probably the most pervasive issue with native birds and also one of the most preventable because you can literally just like go online and buy some different kinds of films, put them over your window. Birds won't crash into them anymore. Yeah, I think for me, it just made the most sense to end up focusing on that one because I think just the point that it was illustrating was the most powerful and also the easiest to practically do something about if somebody was curious to learn more about it.
What do you do with a piece like that once it's been in a show? Do you keep it originally? Do you deconstruct it? How does that work?
I took it apart. I live in a apartment in New York, so I didn't have space for like a hulking, and also the frame this thing was on was about 4 feet deep. So I didn't have space for a 5 by 4 by 6, whatever thing in my apartment. So I broke it down and I made individual frames for each of the pigeons. So I made 9 different frames that were basically 4 pieces of wood holding a see-through piece of plexiglass, so it still looks like a pigeon gliding into a window. A lot of people were interested in the piece, so after I broke it down and made it into these several smaller pieces, I've just been trying to make sure that they go to homes of people who are going to appreciate them. I kept one for myself too.
Yeah. Have you ever had an experience of a bird colliding with any of your windows?
Not personally. I mean, I see it on the street all the time. Not personally, just because I've actually like mostly lived in like small ground floor apartments in my time in New York. So buildings that are a little bit less susceptible to that, or at least the floors I'm on are.
Yeah.
I think another thing that really had me thinking about it a lot on top of seeing it on the street is that I volunteer. I try to go twice a week, but usually it's once a week at the Natural History Museum for the ornithology department. I work in the prep lab making study skins for them. And for anybody who doesn't know, a study skin is sort of a simplified version of taxidermy for research purposes, where you're instead of kind of fully bringing back this three-dimensional lifelike looking animal, you're filling it with cotton and laying it flat so that it can go in a drawer in a research collection so that you have a kind of a wide breadth of different specimens that scientists can go look at when they're looking for information on a particular, in this case, bird.
That's a really excellent description of a study skin, actually.
Oh, thank you. But a ton of those birds that we get, because they get, obviously the Natural History Museum in New York is amazing, so we get birds from all over the country from rehabbers and stuff, birds that don't make it, and that's a lot of them are impact injuries. So I've definitely seen it a lot there.
So, speaking of natural history, your Instagram page is Natural History Mausoleum,
Hmm.
natural.history.mausoleum. And I'm so curious by the choice of the word mausoleum. Can you talk about that?
I mean, firstly, a lot of it is that it's just a pun. um, I mean, yeah, Natural History Mausoleum is a play on Natural History Museum. But I do think I had a bunch of different names on a list when I was sort of coming up with that handle or whatever, and I did land on that one, not just for the reason that it was sort of a play on words, but also that a mausoleum is really I think of as sort of a place to honor the dead, as a place, it's because I think what's the right way to put this? I think the implication with a mausoleum a little bit, as opposed to just like the word cemetery or the word headstone or tomb or something like that, is like kind of a big impressive structure that's really meant to really honor something in sort of a big focused way. And I think I just liked ascribing that word to the taxidermy that I do, just because I think taxidermy is, I think it's really beautiful, and I think it's a really beautiful way to honor dead animals and just to honor the natural world in general. I'm also highly aware that it is a area that a lot of people feel a little weird about. That word, I think, sort of strikes me on the way that I view this stuff, and I would ideally like other people to be able to as well.
At the beginning of the conversation, you talked about as a child wanting to be an ornithologist. Is your love for birds something that came because of like a nature inclination in your family? Where did that love for birds arise from?
I think it came from like a pretty normal 3-year-old child fixation on dinosaurs. I was a big old dinosaur nerd. I still am. And I think when I was 4 years old or whatever, and someone was like, "Hey, you know that birds today are actually dinosaurs?" And I was probably like, "What? That's so cool." I think I was very lucky to have parents who were very encouraging of interests I had, and who I also think had a interest in nature and animals and things like that. And when I was a kid, I would say most of my time I was either in the park, at the zoo, or at the Natural History Museum. So I was always sort of inundated. I do think that the dinosaur thing was the genesis of a lot of it.
So then, where along the way did ornithology get replaced by music and theater and performing arts?
I would say probably around the time that I was in middle school. Certainly middle school, I got really into theater, which was also something that my mom in particular was like very encouraging of. And I think I started focusing on that a lot. I think unfortunately, which is I think an experience for a lot of adolescent people. I mean, I definitely remember feeling sort of around age 11, 12, that sort of area, that like maybe people won't like me as much if like all I want to do is talk about birds. So, I think I sort of started prioritizing some of my other interests. And then, when I was in high school, I was just really angsty and wanted to slam on a guitar. So I was doing that. I mean, but, not to undercut how much I love doing those things. And, certainly music is still a really big part of my life. The interest in ornithology has never really gone away. And I think as I've gotten older, and now especially getting back into taxidermy, it's just keeps bringing me back closer to that again.
This interest in ornithology, does this mean you're also a bird watcher?
Yeah, I mean, again, more so in the last couple of years. I think that this interest in taxidermy has just like totally. I mean, I used to birdwatch a ton when I was a kid. And I used to go out with, it's all sort of a funny roundabout story. I used to go out bird watching a lot with Paul Sweet, who works at the Natural History Museum in the ornithology collection. He was a friend of my mom's. And so he used to take me out bird watching a lot when I was younger with his son and other people from the museum. I mean, I ended up starting to make study skins at the museum because he was at Wunderkammer last year. And he was like, "I don't know if you remember me, but we used to go bird watching when you were a kid." And I was like, "Yeah." And anyway, that's how that conversation started. I went bird watching a lot when I was a kid, and then getting into taxidermy sort of brought me closer to that. And then particularly, I think being at the museum has really brought me closer to that, because I'm there making study skins from the point of view of being really into taxidermy and wanting to learn more about that and animal biology. But everyone else there is like, they're all like ornithology grad students and have like PhDs in ornithology, and they're like, they're really doing the thing from the science. And so they're all so into it. And I've gone out on a couple little bird walks with them and stuff. And I certainly now, in the last couple of years, I usually have binoculars and a Sibley with me most places I go, and I'm trying to buff up those bird watching muscles. If I was walking in Prospect Park or something and I saw a cool bird, I mean, I always drop whatever I'm doing and look at it for as long as it'll let me.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite bird? A species you've developed an affinity for in the last couple years?
I think one of the first bird species I remember being really fascinated by, and has never really gone away, is all the different boobies in the Galapagos, which is I think why they use it so much to explain Darwinism to people. I mean, that particular example really stuck with me when I was a kid, and they're also just like cool looking birds. But I think as I've gotten older, I am just like totally fascinated by all the different kinds of birds of paradise. I mean, I really think that some of those are just prime examples of like looking at an animal and being like, I kind of can't believe that's like a real thing. Like it looks like a cartoon. Like somebody made that up. Like I cannot believe that just exists. I've also, which has been another one, this has been more from the taxidermy side of it, is pheasants. Pheasants are such a kind of, especially like ring-necked pheasants, which are the ones that most people think about. Kind of an easy animal to overlook and not think about, but like the breadth of pheasant species that are out there, and like how diverse and insane they all look, and the colors, and just like the different like They all got crazy hairdos and mohawks and mustache. There's some really, really cool pheasants out there. That's one that in recent years has been sort of a sleeper pick for bird species for me. I mean, then also wading birds too. That's been another huge one. So like spoonbills and ibises and cranes have always been a big one for me.
Yeah, sandhill cranes are just incredibly impressive birds.
Gorgeous. Yeah, they're awesome. I mean, I've got the list of birds that I'd like to see in the wild at some point is long. And
Have you traveled for birding?
no, I mean, I've been lucky enough to do some exciting travel in my life, but a lot of it was in periods of time in my life where that was not a high priority. I mean, I did when I was 16 or something, I was in Kenya for a little bit, and I definitely saw some birds that still really stick with me.
Mhm.
Secretary birds are really cool. That certainly wasn't a bird watching focused trip. I mean, again, I think sort of bringing a lot of the stuff I've been talking about together and definitely inspired by some of the people at the museum going back to school to be able to do
Mm.
some kind of ornithology field research is definitely something I've been thinking a lot about because yeah, I would like to travel more specifically for that
Yeah,
reason. It's a big world, a lot of birds in it.
yeah. You talked about there being a small taxidermy community in New York City. Are there other places in the US that are hotspots or other places in the world where taxidermy has a bigger presence?
Yeah, I mean, in the US, there are little pockets of it all over. I mean, I think a really cool thing about the internet is that I think with communities like the taxidermy community, which are, I think, a little niche, I think a lot of it is like a pretty cohesive unit across the country because especially on the internet, people are able to come together around it. I mean, I think globally, I think certainly Europe and definitely the UK. I mean, I think the kind of modern version of taxidermy as an art form has a lot of its history and its roots in Victorian England because those weirdos were totally obsessed with everything macabre. Yeah, I mean, I think certainly in that part of the world, I think there is a kind of a deeper historical lens for that art
Mhm.
form. I mean, I think in a lot of the US, and this is certainly something I've come across as I've gotten into this with people in my life. I think a lot of people in the US, their association with taxidermy more than anything is hunting.
Mhm.
They think of a dude in a camo vest with a big beard who's got 10 deer heads on his walls or whatever, which is, a archetype for a reason, I guess. But most of the people that I feel like I've met in the taxidermy community, that's like not their vibe. In other places, there are other people who could probably speak to this with more knowledge than me. But I think in other places like the UK, for example, the history of it and the artistic lens from which it's viewed is maybe a little bit wider.
So, in your work and the community that you're part of, New York City, what do you hope that your style of taxidermy, what do you hope people take away from your style of taxidermy and the messages that are part of your pieces?
I mean, I really think that it's two big things, which is, I think, obviously, which I think is something most taxidermy shares is, wanting to instill an appreciation of animals and also the specific animal in that piece and whoever's looking at it. And I think also just like people being able to see it as art, which is how I see it and how a lot, and, as really, really beautiful. And I think a lot of the pieces I've made, and certainly a lot of like, I'll make a lot of like shadow boxes with insects and do painted backgrounds and stuff. And I think trying to find ways to kind of bridge that gap between art and traditional taxidermy can sometimes be a really cool way to pull people in. I mean, I've had a few friends who, I've given them a little butterfly frame or something I've made, and now they have a bird on their wall or something because that little thing was a kind of a good entry
Mm.
point into being able to appreciate it as something larger. Because I actually think, which is I think sort of a misconception. I mean, I don't feel like I have a fixation on death, and I don't feel like a lot of people I know who are really into taxidermy have some like macabre fixation on death. I think most people who are into taxidermy have a fixation on animals and are very aware of because they've died the sort of respect that they deserve. Yeah, I mean, I think that if people can look at a piece of taxidermy that I or anybody else has made and be able to appreciate that animal and also both the kind of the time and the artistry and the work that goes into it, that's a win.
Yeah. You've mentioned the work of making pieces a couple of times. Can you sort of briefly describe maybe the tools you use? Like, what does your workspace look like?
Sure. My workspace is pretty simple. I mean, I've got like a long workbench. They're kind of different tools for different phases. A lot of like scalpels and small scissors and brushes and things like that. I think without going into too much extraneous detail, the general process of taxidermying something is skinning it, taking the skin, cleaning it, preserving it in some kind of way, either through a chemical process or with small birds. You just use a little bit of borax or whatever it is, create a body to replicate the interior structure of the animal, put the skin over that, and then it's sort of a process of fluffing the feathers or the fur and detail work and positioning and grooming and
Hmm.
preening, basically.
What's your favorite part of that? What's your favorite step?
I really like all of it, but I think the most satisfying part, and I've heard this, I don't want to speak for anybody too directly, but I've heard other taxidermists express a similar thing. There's a step, when you're doing a bird or whatever, because you usually at certain points you get it wet, whether you're washing it or using soap to try to get fat off of it or whatever it is. So you'll have this wet skin and these wet feathers and stuff. And there is a moment when you get the blow dryer out to dry it off. All of a sudden, this thing that you've been taking apart and you've gotten all wet and you've put all this stuff on and all that, it suddenly like turns back into a bird. So I think that moment is really cool.
I'm
Yeah.
nodding my head here because I had an experience with a red-tailed hawk, the only red-tailed hawk I've made a study skin of, and the bird had a wing injury from colliding with a vehicle. And so there was a lot of blood and having to wash the skin. And actually, it makes the bird so much, it diminishes the bird when the feathers are wet. And then using the blow dryer, it was a little bit of a salon moment. And I don't mean that in
Mhm.
a disrespectful way. But yeah, you feel like the almost like life come back into that skin because
Mhm.
you begin to see what the bird looked like when it was
Yeah.
alive. Yeah.
And I think something that you touched on there too is especially in the unfortunate but sometimes often instance of, a sort of traumatic death like that. It's also this moment where even before it sort of gets the feathers get deflated by getting them wet or whatever, when you first saw that hawk, I'm guessing with the blood and everything, it was kind of a mess. And then you get to see that hawk at what it looked like when, it was at its prime. It's a pretty special moment getting to kind of see it reanimate.
Yeah. My final question for you, Emmett, is what are you working on next?
I'm working on a couple of things. The big project that I've been kind of going in and out of for a bit because it's way bigger than anything I've worked on is I'm mounting a pony right now. And that has been difficult for a lot of reasons. One being size, and the other one being most of my experience has been working with birds, and mammals are really different
Yeah.
in a lot of ways. It's a very different process. So that's been the big project I've been working on. And then I have some other things. I have some. I just pinned like 30 really cool beetles and stick insects and stuff. So I'm putting together some domes. I have a couple of old birds that I'm cleaning up and restoring. That's the really big like goal project right now that I'm trying to get to come out in a way I'm happy with.
Okay, I have to follow up. A pony. So is this a commission piece? Is this a piece that you're entering into a competition? What's the backstory?
I was getting some other animals from somebody, some frozen animals, and they said, I have this pony. Do you want it? And I said, yes, please. Because I just I've never worked on something like that, so I thought it would be a good challenge. Not for any kind of competition or commission. I just had the opportunity to work on it. It was not something I've done before. I thought I might learn a lot in doing it, which we'll see how it turns out.
Yeah.
Jury is out, but I have learned a lot working on it. And then, with pieces like that, because I do a lot of work like that where I have the opportunity to work on something, so I work on it even if it isn't for a specific person or event or something. And then, when it's finished, depending on how it comes out, somebody else wants it, I'll sell it, or if I get really attached to it, which I sometimes do, I'll keep it.
Okay. Well, I'd love to see the final pony. And if folks are interested in learning more about your work or taxidermy in general, what's like the one place you would send them to?
Well, I would say if you're interested in learning more about my work, you can visit me on Instagram at Natural History Mausoleum. But if you're interested in learning about taxidermy, I've brought her up a couple of times, but Divya of Gotham Taxidermy, the Gotham Taxidermy website has a couple of really awesome pages that I remember I was looking at a lot when I first started. There's a whole page just about the different laws about taxidermy, some sort of intro beginner tutorials, a lot of great books and resources and internet videos and stuff. But I think that just in terms of something that's like going to be really immediately accessible to anybody, that's a great resource to look at. Another place that I really recommend for anybody who's interested in learning more about taxidermy, oddly enough, is there is a pretty great taxidermy subreddit, which I think is great because a lot of that is more from the perspective of that's so much of what's posted on there is people who are like, this is my first project, or like, I'm just starting out. How do I do this thing? So I think if you're interested in learning more, that's kind of a good place to go, where you're going to see a lot of people who are also starting out and sort of sharing ideas and getting feedback from other people. So I know you said one and that was more than one, but those are a couple places if someone wants to learn more, get into it themselves, which I encourage. We want to see the community grow. So, get into it.
Yeah, I will definitely link to your Instagram and I'll include Gotham Taxidermy and the taxidermy subreddit links in the show.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Emmett, well, thank you so much for taking time out of your Saturday morning to talk to me.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate you having me on, and maybe we'll go on a bird walk together sometime.
That would be awesome.
Yeah. Thanks, Georgia. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Your Bird Story. Like, share, subscribe, and we'll see you back here next month.